So we've made it through the first week of the new year, but what's coming up in 2022? From jobs to climate change to politics, we want to spend the next few minutes talking about what this year holds for Africa. Now, for one, the pandemic is still with us, and the vast majority of people in Africa are yet to be vaccinated. Now, according to the Africa CDC, less than 10% of people on the continent have received the jab. The good news is that the same CDC says severe lockdowns are no longer the best way to contain COVID-19. So that's the pandemic, but what else will be on the horizon for Africa this year? Well, we've invited Lindsay Chattel onto the program to talk more about that. She is a journalist with the New York Times based in South Africa. It's good to have you on the program, Lindsay. But actually, before we get away from the pandemic, we're hearing that there'll be no more severe lockdowns. But what does the CDC suggest that the authorities do instead?
Hi, Christine. Thanks for having me. I think the Africa CDC's pronouncement that we shouldn't look at severe lockdowns as a means to curb the pandemic has really shifted the focus to vaccinations. And what that is I think, is to sort of encourage more people to get vaccinated, encourage countries to push for vaccinations. However, December 31st was the target for the majority of African countries to at least vaccinate 10% of their populations, and most missed that. And I think that's an indication of just the fact that, other countries might be in maybe in a later phase of the pandemic, but for so many African countries, we're still very much in the primary phase of this pandemic because such large parts of our populations are still particularly vulnerable. And while there has been some optimism around the Omicron variant being less severe, we can't relax just yet because the WHO and the Africa CDC have warned continuously that the longer we have populations that remain unvaccinated, the more there is the threat of new variants spreading and new variants developing and spreading. And so, even the next phase, 2022 of the pandemic, is very much still a very cautious point for the African continent.
Right. I mean, we've got to talk about the economy, right? Because economic recovery from the pandemic is also a major theme in Africa this year. What can we expect on that front?
Well, I think, when we look at the economy and so much of the continent, we look at sort of before pandemic and after pandemic. And before the pandemic, there was a lot of optimism around ACFA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And this was meant to finally open up the continent to get rid of these archaic laws that made trade between countries so difficult and suppress trade on the continent. But that was before the pandemic. And we know that the pandemic has really suppressed growth on the continent. And there has been some discussion of international assistance. There was a summit in Paris last year. There was the Africa-Turkey summit towards the end of the year. And we know that the African Union and the European Union will meet in Brussels in February. But what we need to be paying attention to is what these high-level promises will translate to on the continent and on the ground. And I think we cannot talk about the African economy without looking at the informal sector. There have been various attempts at formalizing that sector, at really taking advantage of it. But the truth of the matter is that the pandemic suppressed the sector even further. This is where a lot of young Africans find work, where they are able to push their own businesses, but with a lack of, with importing from China made it so much more difficult by the pandemic because that's where most people got the inexpensive goods, and also just movement between countries made it even more difficult because we know, for example, in South Africa, traders in Zimbabwe will come to buy here and then go back. That movement was, again, hampered by the pandemic. So when we're looking at post-pandemic development, it's very much a sort of wait-and-see game.
And what about politics, Lindsay? I know Sudan is one to watch. There are real fears of military rule there. What other developments will you be watching?
I think the Horn of Africa is an interesting point at all times, particularly this year. We see the war in Ethiopia and what that will mean, particularly because there's a real humanitarian crisis unfolding there. We're also looking at the Sahel region, we know that, and how local politics will affect the region's ability to respond to that insurgency. We know that Mali, for example, has had 2 coups within a year after the death of the Chad strongman Idris Deby. That country that used to be that played quite a key role in the G5 force, they might have to pull back to some extent too. And so one wonders then, sort of in this vacuum, what that means for the region's ability to fight against an insurgency. But we've also got some big elections coming up. Kenya is happening in August. Angola will be having an election too. So those are just our key stories that we'll be paying attention to.
That's right. Well, I wondered, Lindsay, What highlights are you personally looking forward to this year, 2022?
Well, I think what I'm hoping for, and I think what so many people around the world are hoping for, is that as the world reopens, that we do have an increase and see more culture happening. Just before the pandemic, Africa was really having a really collaborative sense of culture in terms of fashion, in terms of music, and then that just all died down during the pandemic. And so I'm really hoping that we get back to those kind of festivals that saw these really international lineups in places like Malawi and Eswatini, and fashion weeks will return. And because I think that really helps to change the narrative around Africa, that it's not just about conflict, it's not just about strongmen, that the people on the ground are doing interesting cultural things. And I hope once again that we'll see that.
Right. Well, I hope we'll see you at the end of the year to catch up on some of the things that would have happened. Lindsay, good to have you on the program. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.